And Resiliency really has a spectrum of applications. And this particular focus today is on resiliency building through data sharing. And we have a really exciting topic. I know that many of you are interested in data sharing, so we've got 16 family resource centers here in Humboldt County that are sharing data across their sites, and I think that'll be something that's really interesting for you to learn more about today. These are the various counties that we have joining us today. We have our online folks, and we've got a good number of online folks, probably close to 30 are joining us today, and they're from all different counties, and we welcome you, and we're very happy to have you joining us today online. And as you know, we're here in Eureka. We also say welcome to Lake County. We've got a fair number of people that are also joining us from Lake County, so we're delighted to have them. And we also have a remote location in Shasta County, and we have a remote location in Siskiyou County. And we're very delighted. First Five has been an important partner in our work, and First Five is convening the host site in Shasta County and in Siskiyou County. And the County Office of Education in Lake County is hosting the remote site there. And of course, we are at Family Resource Center here in, is it Jefferson Street? Jefferson Street. And it's a delightful place, and there's an amazing history here to this Family Resource Center. So we have excellent participation today, and we thank you for joining us. As most of you know, Strategies 2.0 is funded by the California Office for Child Abuse and Prevention, otherwise known as OCAP. And I just want to really give a shout out to them because they're doing some really interesting things. And one of the things that they just launched into just last month was a convening of a prevention summit, and the first time ever that they have done this convening. And they had about 28 counties there, and it was just a really interesting way of getting teams from various counties to think together about child abuse prevention, but thinking more broadly about child well-being and what that might look like in their counties. And so I think child abuse from OCAP's perspective is trying to move further upstream and go more toward prevention. And I think that is really something that we can all be excited about as we're thinking about this in our work. The mission of Strategies 2.0, you're probably familiar with the work that they're doing statewide. And of course, mitigating the risk factors for child abuse and neglect is a big part of the focus of the work. But it's also interesting and important to remember that they're looking at child and family and community well-being as well. So that broadens the way that we think about our work and the way we think about networking. So this is a wonderful line that is easy for us, the tagline for thinking about strategies, growing knowledge and networks for professionals working with families. That's really the tagline for what it is that we're doing together through strategies, and there are different components to that. And one is training, and probably many of you have already been through different trainings that Strategies offers. Consulting, and then today we're participating in a learning community. And a learning community is really shaped by the participation and the people who are providing input and feedback on what it is that we do each time that we do this. We do about 4 learning communities a year. This is a way that you can participate through social media, sign up for newsletters, well, not on social media quite yet, but signing up for newsletters and registering for trainings, and of course registering for the learning communities. And as we already mentioned, we're really looking at learning communities as a place where we can think across sectors. So when we look at who's in our room and who's online, we realize that we have folks that are from different sectors, and that whole notion of how we can work together and align our efforts. We were just talking about that a little bit here in our site, in hub site here in Eureka, before we got started. The significance of how we're doing our work and how we can align our efforts to increase impact. And data sharing is one of those tools that enables us to align our work. And then, of course, learning communities are also looking at a way for us to think about how we can look at the pressing problems throughout our region and how we might address them most effectively. And our pressing problems are pretty thematic. It's not as though there's a different, issue that's coming up in all 12 of our northern region counties. There are things that we all have in common. And so how might we be able to increase our impact in addressing those issues? When we do our evaluations at the end of each session, of course, those are really important for us to be able to take a look at session by session. But at the end of each year, there's also a survey that's put out to all of the participants so that we can get a sense of, what was worthy of being applied, or what did you take home, something that you found useful. So when we did this the last go round, which was the first time that we tried doing an annual survey, we had a 10% response rate. And out of that group of people, 84% said that they gained or implemented skills or tools or knowledge from our learning communities. So we're really pleased that people are participating and that they're able to take things away from each learning community that might be applicable in their side. Doesn't have to be an earth-shattering thing. Sometimes a small thing makes a big difference. Here we are with the social media. So these are different ways that you can interact using social media, using the hashtags Northern LC or Resiliency. So this is the agenda for today. Right now we're in the welcome and introduction piece. Our presenters for today will be Mark Weller and Amy Dubé. They both work with Humboldt Network of Family Resource Centers, and they can tell you a little bit more about their work as they get into that piece. And they both are working together. There is a data committee that goes with their network of Family Resource Centers, and they are the co-chairs of that data committee. And they also have roles in an FRC. So Mark works with this FRC and Amy works with the Humboldt FRC. Fortuna, forgive me. And there will be time for question and answers as we're moving through the presentation. And the way that we typically handle question and answer, because we're working remotely, is that we're looking for the person who is the host in each one of the remote sites to kind of get a sense of maybe two pressing questions to get, there may be more than two pressing questions, but to kind of see, are there some common things in the questions, and then to be able to put forward a couple questions that we can address. If we have more time, then we might be able to address more than a couple questions from each remote site. But we try to start out with a couple questions, and of course the folks that are joining us online can chat. And then we will have, as I mentioned, reflections at the end, which are some thought questions that take us back to a kind of an overview of the presentation and some of the take-homes that you might be able to find, tips and things that might excite you, and things you may be already doing around data collection and the challenges that you might be coming up against, because data collection, especially if you're doing it across partners, is a challenge. So we'll address that at the end, and then we'll conclude with evaluation. So our objectives for today, we're going to, as mentioned, continue to move forward the lens of resiliency and looking at data sharing, because data sharing is especially relevant to achieving collective impact. And we're going to look at how the protective factors survey can be utilized in promoting resiliency, because that is the tool that the 16 family resource centers are using across them to be able to look at how they can promote resiliency, achieve impact, and how this has a bearing on their menu services. And then we're going to actually do some step-by-step looking at how they set up their data sharing. So there will be nuts and bolts to how they're making this work. Some of the assumptions that we come into today, every time we gather around a table, there are some assumptions in the room, and the assumptions that we're making today behind this data sharing lens is that data sharing is a key element in collective impact. And when I say that, I'm not just using the two words, collective impact, because those two words have meaning just in themselves. But when you're thinking about collective impact as an actual approach and a model to how we do our work, then one of the elements of achieving collective impact is that there are some common measures and some common data that's being shared. And of course, data assists in making a case for prevention. It assists in making a case for whatever it is that you're really trying to move forward. If you have an issue that matters, then if you can ground it in some statistics that are able, sometimes a number speaks volumes of words. So that's one of the reasons why we're taking a look at the significance of data. And then, of course, when you're trying to create a common agenda, as it's called, when you're looking at achieving collective impact using that model, then data helps to create a common agenda, a common purpose. You're able to look at, hey, look what we've seen here in our community. We've got A, B, C, D things that are really high priorities. What are we going to do about that? And that gets us to helping to align our efforts, especially when we're working across different sectors. And it helps us to kind of say, this is something that we can all have a piece in, and by really working together, we can increase the impact and mutually reinforce one another's efforts. Another assumption is that data collection, just in general, is an important element of a strong organization. And I'm certain that most organizations that are represented today are collecting data of some sort. I'm forgetting the expression that used to be used, but it always struck me kind of amusing, that data was along the lines of data being one of the best kept secrets in a community, because every organization is collecting quite a bit, but it never sees the light of day. And it doesn't really get a chance to get out there so everybody can see it. Most people that have a grant or are working on projects that are grant funded have to make reports to their grantor. They've got numbers in those reports, but many times none of that data actually gets to see the light. So we're trying to bring some of that data to light and to underscore the significance of organizations collecting data as a way for them to inform their own work, and then thinking about it more broadly, how we share data across our partners. And then, as I already alluded to, we're making the assumption that most of us are in this work because we're trying in some way to make positive social change. And without numbers, you can talk about the needs, and you can talk about your experiences. But I just know from work in my own community that when you're actually able to say, this is the situation, these are how many people are dealing with this, this is the percentage of our population that's facing this challenge, it makes a tremendous amount of difference in mobilizing people and rallying them together and creating momentum around something that you're trying to promote together. So I already went through this a little bit. We have Mark Weller, he's Jefferson FRC Deputy Director, Chair of Humboldt County's Network of FRCs, Co-Chair of the Network Stated Committee, and Amy Dubé, who is the Fortuna FRC Coordinator and Co-Chair of the Network Stated Committee. So that brings us to our presentation, and I'm going to turn the time over to Mark and Amy. And again, they will give you presentation. There will be some time for Q&A, and then we'll have a break, and there'll be presentation and some time for Q&A, and then reflection at the end. So Mark and Amy, welcome, and it's all yours.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you all in the room here for joining us. And we're going to be first introducing what our network is. We'll probably introduce ourselves halfway through, so for the next 5 minutes, if things are out of order, just bear with us. You'll get the answers. So we're going to proceed. We'll get our clicker.
Yes, it's important.
Okay. Oh, yeah, you're going to be better at the clicker than I will be. So, Humboldt Network of Family Resource Centers, our mission, through collaboration, mutual support, and respect, our family strengthening network improves child, family, and community health and well-being. The map. A little bit of an understanding of who we are is really where we are. We're in Humboldt County. We have a massive geographic region that our network spans. HNFRC is a consortium of 17 family and community centers, resource centers located throughout Humboldt County. We are an area of 3,500 square miles, starting 200 miles north of San Francisco, and I think going up another 100 plus beyond that. Humboldt County, our centers are everywhere from McKinleyville to the north, out to Hoopa and Willow Creek to the east. It's about 50 miles east in the hills, all the way south to Redway. We have coordinators who are working on data projects together and coordinators who get stuck from going to a meeting because a tree fell on the road. So we navigate every element out there in the world. Go too forward. Our network has also a complexity in our structure. It is not an agency. It's not its own 501c3. It's a collaborative between these agencies. It doesn't have an employee. It doesn't sit on a massive pile of cash. So when we think about how we work together, a lot of this is from coordinators at different sites, collaborating through committees, through joint projects, as a big group. Every kind of thing that you can imagine. We're certainly not tied in one building on some local area network. So we really need to work on these tricky questions of how do we all share with each other. So to go to the goal of our network, at its core, HNFRC seeks to help network members better serve our communities through peer support, technical assistance and cross-training, joint funding projects, joint project implementation, advocacy, and joint reporting. And this is Amy and me. I'm probably wearing the same shirt because it's my one dress shirt. So I serve as the chairperson of Humboldt Network of Family Resource Centers. It's a one-year position. And in that time, my role is to help us kind of navigate the next hurdles of this year. And this year has been largely focused on how do we revamp our reporting? How do we streamline our tracking? How do we represent our group and its face and what we're learning from ourselves better? How do we connect our reports not just to our funders, but also to the community so that anybody can go and read this and say, I know what an FRC is, I know what they're up to. And Amy?
That's me. That's all I got. Oh, so now it's my turn. All right, so we're going to just start by talking about the history of what our data and reporting was. We've been sharing data through our network for many years, but it's just become more of a project in these past few years to try to revamp it, clean it up, and make it more usable and more impactful for our network. So like I said, we've had data sharing before. We've had Excel spreadsheets for service tracking where we track the individual services that we offer. And they've worked, but they've needed to be updated and reviewed according to current contracts and our current goals. We wanted to make sure that our data was not cumbersome for the people working on the ground level and making sure that it flowed easily with the work that we do. So we acknowledged when collecting and sharing data was not flowing easily with that work. And then we listened to members about their experiences And we broke into, this was a long process of listening to members about their experiences with data and really pulling that out through smaller settings to try to hear feedback about what the barriers were and what we wanted it to look like, what our goals were. And as Susan said, we used our data committee to drill down on current systems and focus on change. And like I said, this was a long process. I think it's probably been at least 2 years in the making. And so it was a whole long process of listening, focusing on what it was and what we wanted it to be, and then using a data committee once a month for 2 years to work on how we're going to change that. I will also say that we were collecting outcomes data during that time, and we were married to a system that was not favored by a majority of our sites. And so we needed to think about what that looked like and what we actually wanted for outcomes data and for surveys that we were issuing to clients. Yeah.
So today we're going to talk about some of the systems change work that we've done. And the disclosure is you're not going to get a magic key. Anybody sitting here with a spreadsheet ready to type in the magic formula that builds this report all of a sudden, it took a hell of a lot more work than that. But we will talk about some of the process to get there. And in a little while, we will actually look at the actual system that we built in a video and navigate through some of those pieces. So hopefully we'll get to address everything from the kind of planning side of it to the actual nuts and bolts. What I want to start with here, though, is the systems change. And like Amy said, this has been a 2-year project to get data changed. It's not like we just worked really slowly. In fact, we felt like we were cramming all the time. When you have a group this complex, when you're working between agencies, when you have 5, 6, 7 different funders that are funding all in parts of your coalition, you have a lot of people to check in with, and there is a whole lot of work to do. So one of the best things to do here is to start with your roots. It's kind of a strategic planning technique, but you say, what work are we doing as agencies? What's getting in the way of the work that we're doing? Who are we trying to serve and how? Are the tools that we have today telling us about our work? Are they working well with our clients? Are they cumbersome for us? And when we start to come up and say, hey, there's some gaps here, that's when we need to gather as a group and commit to working toward that change. And that is a huge thing to do, and it's a big commitment to make. In our network, it was manifested as forming a data committee that spent every month for years working on this. We have an executive committee that supervises it. We have an outside consultant who supports the group. It has been hundreds and hundreds of hours to make some changes that seemed really simple up front that are certainly not. So when you commit as a group, you want to be able to say, we see the problems and we want solutions. We want to be able to accept that change will take a lot of work and time. And we want to commit as a group to work together throughout the change process. It is really easy to have one site or one person drive change. And the unfortunate thing is that when you're working between agencies, especially with very different agencies, it can't happen that way. It needs to be a group process. It needs to have a feedback loop. It needs to have people contributing. There will be snags. It will not be perfect for everybody. There will be compromise. And that's been something that we've worked diligently on. And I can say 2 years down the road, we still have some things that we're looking to iron out. But systems change is about that. It's about going from a state of tradition of the past and moving to something new. It's very uncomfortable, but it's an important thing to practice. So just to do a throwback slide to all of our PowerPoint from the 1990s, I threw in 3 little images here just so we can have some fun. Systems change. The things that really matter are covering your bases. Are you listening to your boots on the ground? I can be the chair of the network, I can be the deputy director of the agency, but if I am not working one-on-one with a client, I am not in tune with what it looks like to build trust with somebody, with what it looks like to hand them a 55-question survey and have them fill it out, and how that develops that relationship, and if we hit stumbling blocks. One of the first things that we did in this work was to really in-depth talk with our A-Factor AmeriCorps members, our frontline staff, our case managers, the people that are doing the boots on the ground work, and to establish a continuous feedback loop with them. That's gold, and you need to keep that the whole way through, from before you ever start changing something until all the way after you've done it, and just keep that going. That's like step 0. So again, establish that continuous feedback loop. Those are your people. We can be the talking bobbleheads up at the executive level, but that doesn't help much if what we preach doesn't land. The other piece, and this is one of the tricky ones, is to ask yourself, what are we married to today? It's kind of a funny term, but what it really means is you have grants, you have funding, you have contracts, you might even have informal agreements with partner agencies. You need to start digging and saying, what have I committed to? Are there things that I'm going to be in a material breach of in my contract if I just rapidly change out what I'm tracking? And the answer is typically yes. There are some roadblocks in there that you need to look at, some guidelines you need to go and look at. So we dug into county contracts, we dug into partnerships with different agencies, we started to map out, okay, well, we have these sub-coalitions of 5 or 6 members working with this funder or on this project. What do they owe that funder? Is there a way to parse it out? And then we also started working with all those funders and partner agencies to establish flexibility, to say, hey, rather than naming a specific outcomes tool by name, by proprietary software name, can we use a generic something like, we will measure client outcomes using an evidence-based tool? That gives us the flexibility to change, to pick one that might work best for us. And that's exactly what we did. We went down to contract season, we had a talk with the county, we explained some of the snags we've been hitting, we talked about some of the goals that we had, we asked for the flexibility in the language. We had absolutely no resistance. It makes sense, and it's something that they're willing to support. So I would hope for anybody else that tries that you hit that same tailwind. And then a big question in all of this is, who is affected by your proposed changes? I mentioned partner agencies, and one of the things that has been a little bit more cryptic for us to seek out has been, who are those agencies that were kind of passively receiving data from us or passively sharing with us that we have no contract with, we have no agreement with, but what we are doing is supporting what they're doing. And so it's good to keep them in the loop. And the best way to do it is, if you have other agencies you're working with, tell them what you're up to. Tell them you're looking at making changes. Invite them to a meeting here and there. It's not going to spoil the process. It'll actually build on it. And so that's what we've been trying to do. We have people like the California Center for Rural Policy, the Redwood Community Action Agency, some other agencies that we partner with, although not through a formal context, that we're trying to keep in the loop as we make these changes, because what we do may affect what they do. My own tools, your own tools and methods.
My own tools and methods. So, how to select new tools and methods. We started by thinking about where we were trying to get with our data collection and sharing, and really envisioning what we wanted that to look like. And I think that some of our goals were to come back and to be concise and meaningful and impactful with the data we were collecting. We had been collecting data, as I said, for a very long time. And sometimes I think that over the course of time, it got vague and muddled. And so I think that to go back to what we wanted that to be was concise and meaningful in a way that everybody was counting and collecting with the same idea. And so we really tried to survey and get feedback from all 16 sites about what we all wanted it to look like. And then we focused on what is helpful with our work toward the resilience of clients and our own agencies. As Mark talked about, we tried to focus on getting feedback and really staying in contact with the people who are the boots on the ground, who are the ones working with the clients and issuing the surveys and having to put the data in on top of the actual work that they're doing. And so to make that easily usable or accessible, and that it flowed nicely with the work, and that it wasn't a hindrance to working with clients. Like Mark said, issuing someone a survey that was either 55 questions long or had intrusive questions that made someone maybe not want to come back and work with you, or some other barriers there. And so we wanted to make sure that the tools that we chose and the way that we chose to input data and input surveys were more accessible. Let's see, what does the future look like? Again, we got feedback from all of our sites and talked about it as a group for a very long time. And we wanted data that tells a story, and again, that has an impact, that we can put into a report that shows our funders and our partners what we're doing, and a real clear vision of what we're doing. As you can imagine, with 16 sites that don't all do the exact same thing. We all have a commonality among us, but we do many different events and we have different styles of working. So we wanted to make sure that we agreed upon one common idea that we wanted to get across, and then allow for individuality within certain sites. We wanted data that could achieve more funding on the work that we do, and that told a story. What are the pros, the cons, the costs, and the benefits? For this, we worked a long time on trying to figure out what systems we were going to move toward, and we considered quite a few in the process. What we ended up doing was looking at what other organizations and agencies were using around us and what they liked. And so we ended up, as has already been said, we ended up with the Protective Factors Survey as our outcomes data, and that was already used by our AmeriCorps members within our county. And so again, going back to the idea that the people who are the boots on the ground, we wanted to make it easier for them and to not have to issue multiple surveys just because that's what we chose, but to try to integrate it all and make us all do the same thing. What fits with our vision of resilience? Again, I think like I've already touched on, when we choose outcomes data and those surveys, one of my visions was to make sure that we were focusing on the resilience of the clients, making it easier for them, for our work with them and our relationship, and then the resilience of our network and the ability and the flexibility, like Mark said, with taking certain language out of our contracts and making our tools easily used and editable so that we can focus on flexibility in the future so that we're not stuck into a certain system.
So, and then a last tie-in on the costs and benefits. For those who are wondering, hey, what are the numbers behind this? We were spending tens of thousands a year on data systems and the support that went along with them, and it is a huge cost. And I can tell you that the system that we're going to show a little bit later today, we have spent not a single dollar on. It's been a lot of sweat equity, but right now we are not subscribed to any service. We do not pay anybody a fee. And if we want to go in there and edit it, it's a matter of logging into our account and clicking a button. So for somebody who's thinking about just kind of the numbers game behind this, that's a huge change. That's a lot of money back into pockets, back toward people working on the ground. And the benefits to it, the other thing with having some proprietary software systems, and I'm not going to say they're bad, I'm just going to say it's decisions that you make, is your gatekeepers. In the past, we've had systems where perhaps only one site or very few people would have access to the source data, the ability to actually look at what's going into this system. And Susan had brought up earlier, well, it's tough when you have data that only a couple people see. You can't really share it, you can't really collect it. What we're going to show you later is a data system that from the raw data all the way to the reports is completely transparent for all 16 members. And there's something incredibly important in that. It's complex, but I'd like us to be thinking about kind of this idea of transparency, this idea of sharing, this idea of having all people be a gatekeeper. And so that's kind of our wrap up to this early part, which is the planning, the structure, the overview. What Amy and I would like to do is to answer any questions that you might have at this stage before we get into the nuts and bolts.
Okay, thank you so much. Excellent. So we'll take some time now to do some question and answer. Let's start right here. Since we have a group of people, let's take maybe a couple questions. Does anything, I know that most of you in this room are probably familiar with this because you're a part of the network in some way, or you have familiarity with what the Family Resource Centers are doing. But is there any question that percolates up? We'll start here, and then that will give the other sites a little bit of time to maybe think about their questions. Is there anything that comes up for you?
You might go over this later, so we jump ahead, or I missed something. Do all 16 sites use the protective factor survey when they collect and measure data?
At this point,
So the question was, do all 16 of our sites use the protective factor survey to collect and measure data? At the turn of this fiscal year, that's what we committed to as our new tool. It also made it such that our A-Factory AmeriCorps members, we have 10 across 8 sites, went from having to use 2 different outcomes tools down to just 1. So it simplified it for them as well. But yes, we all do it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you all share data outside of the network of FRCs as far as other county agencies, or is the tool that you use mostly an internal, as far as internal within the network?
So, and the question was, do we share data beyond just our internal network? Do we share it with other partners or other agencies? Right now, with our new system, we have it getting fed out to our county funders. We also are looking at integrating it into Redwood Community Action Agency to have them have access as an outside partner who can log in and see our raw data. It's something that we're building a system that's robust enough to allow people from outside of our agency to come in and look at it without compromising the security or integrity of the data. So yes, we're working on that, but we're early in that stage.
Thank you. Are you going to touch on at some point what made the protective factor survey kind of pop up to the top as your tool?
I think we could answer a little bit about that. So the question is, what made the protective factor survey the tool that we wanted to choose? There were a couple pieces behind that. One, and originally we had the family development matrix. It's a very robust tool. It asks a lot of good questions. It gathers good outcomes data on a client. However, one of the complications that sites kept bringing up was that, hey, one, it's a long survey. You ask a lot of questions. It also has some questions that can be kind of piercing. And so people were concerned that it might not be the best trust building tool at a first encounter with the client. And that was heard from site after site after site. And that's really what started to make us ask the question, okay, well, are we just curmudgeonly about doing data at all, or do we really have something here? And what came up is that we had something there. There were some valid concerns, and we said, okay, let's look at other tools. One of the first ones that came to mind was the protective factors survey, and it's because we had our A-Factor AmeriCorps already on task to do that at several sites. And so we began looking into that tool, comparing it with the FDM. I think some other outcomes tools were peaked at for a while, things like ages and stages questionnaires, the ASQ assessments. There are some that are more clinical in nature, and we wanted one that was more broad, one that could be applied at a play group, one that could be applied in a more casual setting. And the protective factor survey just really quickly elevated to that level. It's open source, it's evidence-based, it's got it in English and Spanish. It kind of hit all those metrics of something that looked like it would work. And when we floated it by our boots on the ground, they said, hey, I could issue this survey to a family and have it be really organic and natural. We could build trust, and it would not set us back. In fact, it might be a fun conversational piece. And that was kind of the golden key that said, all right, this is something we really need to see through.
Right, and I would add that some of the questions for the family development matrix were questions that, like Mark said, were piercing and maybe I would even say triggering for some clients, and that wasn't necessarily something that workers were prepared to deal with after issuing a survey. And so we wanted to be careful about the tool that we chose in the future, that it was more friendly for clients and for the people that are working with the clients, and to not make it so that in that moment you need to turn around and either be a therapist or refer to a therapist or get into a conversation that really wasn't the point of the visit. And so we wanted to focus on the survey being a more friendly tool, I suppose, and to make it so that we felt comfortable issuing it and talking about those questions, that we were prepared to even discuss those kinds of things with the client. So.
Excellent. Yes. We have a question that was actually asked by chat from one of our members in the county. They would like to know, do you provide any incentives for families to finish the survey?
Sites do incentives for families to finish the survey. I haven't heard about that yet. I think that would be an interesting approach. One of the things that we're working on right now behind the scenes is developing best practices around this tool. So the questions with an outcomes tool are, do you implement it the pre-survey immediately upon meeting a client, or it's somewhere into the relationship building process? Do you do the post-survey 90 days out, or do you do it after 4 hours of service, or do you do it after 90 days and 4 hours of service? The key thing that I think has come up when we've been researching kind of best practices is not to do something that will intentionally bias your data. So incentives, and I'm not saying that they're a bad thing, but I would say that proceed with caution and know that what you really want is you want honest, genuine answers, and you want somebody to give it freely. So I personally would not tie it to a monetary or otherwise like incentivized reward for doing a survey. I would want it to be something that somebody willingly took.
And I know that we have 16 sites, so we have 16 sites that choose how to and when to issue it. And like Mark said, we're trying to issue best practices for the entire network. But I know for our site in Fortuna, we don't issue it the first time that people come, and we make it optional. We just say, if you'd like to fill out the survey, you're more than welcome. You don't have to. But we also have some sites that I know in the past have made surveys mandatory for receiving services. So that's something we're working through as a network.
And it's not necessarily something that we will come to a hard and fast rule on for all of our members. It may be something that we just leave open for some level of flexibility. Again, you can get really puritanical with an evidence-based tool and just try to say you're going to do this and this and this and this. And then you need to open up and say, I have 16 sites that manifest in so many different ways. And we can still use an evidence-based tool in a reasonably scientific way without going so hardline. And we're probably going to be somewhere in a hybridized stage.
And to always come back to the work that it is we're here to do, and to not get so puritanical where we're pushing clients away or where they're not going to feel comfortable coming in and answering those questions. Our first goal is to help our community and to do the work that we do, and not necessarily data. Data helps us do the work that we do, but we're trying to make those both fit nicely together so we can do both.
It was a good question.
Yes, this one is from Stephen Bryan. Who are your funding partners? Have they honored the results of the tool as an evaluation report?
Yeah, so one of our main funders for Humboldt Network of Family Resource Centers is the Department of Health and Human Services. It's a funding partnership between CalFresh, CalWorks, and CWS, although we interact with pretty much every department within DHHS. One of the kind of sister agencies that we have over at DHHS is Public Health. And they have a parenting program called Safe Care that actually has already been using the protective factors survey prior to us onboarding to it. And so it's actually been a really cool process. We've been able to compare some notes, talk to their manager and say, hey, how did this work for you all? What are your best practices on it? We're kind of still exploring some of those questions. But it's a tool that's already been seen by our funder, and it's a tool that's already been vetted through them. It's been applied in a different setting. So that, again, that's one of those natural fits that made this an easier process. We weren't bringing in some totally outside, unheard of thing that nobody had ever seen. We're bringing in something that, in fact, the funder's already using, at least in one regard. And we're saying, hey, we're going to try to use it ourselves as well. So in that sense, it's been a pretty easy process. They were familiar with the tool, and they were all for us giving it a shot.
Any more questions?
That's all we have online at this time.
Okay. Shall we go to the remote sites? Or are the questions coming out?
One thing from Lake County is chat. If there are any remote sites that would like to ask a question over audio, you're welcome to do so now.
No more questions. Okay, good. Those were excellent questions. And I just want to kind of reiterate the fact that because of the way the learning communities are set up with remote locations and online locations and people in the physical space, the networking doesn't feel the same necessarily as when you are in, everybody is in one room. But nonetheless, this is how networking happens, asking questions across these different remote locations as well as online. It gives us a chance to all think together, even though we're in these different places and we're trying to use technology as best as possible, to be able to think together across this region about how do we do certain things. And I also really want to reiterate again that there is a tremendous amount of expertise in our own communities and in our own region that sometimes doesn't get promoted up to a place where people can acknowledge it. So Mark and Wendy and what they've been doing here in Humboldt County, they are local experts on how this process has been put together. And who knows, one day they may become national experts on, how all of this is working as they continue to grow and develop it. But I really want to underscore the fact that there's a lot of expertise in each one of our communities that we can draw from in what it is that we're wanting to accomplish. And so just to kind of keep that in mind as we continue moving through presentation that I'm sure wherever you are, whether you're online or in your own remote location, you're thinking about, well, who are the data people in our community and how have we been sharing data? And we'll get a little bit more to that when we get to the end and have the reflection questions. So let's see. Well, we're coming up on time for our break, so we'll take a short break and 10 minutes. So if you have something in your site or in your office, wherever you might be online, we'll regroup in 10 minutes and come back for part 2. Thank you. everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break, that you got something accomplished that needed to be done during that 10 minutes. So I'm going to turn the time back over to Mark and Amy and let them continue on with part 2 of their presentation, and we'll have some time for question and answer again at the end of this section. So, Mark and Wendy. I mean Amy, I'm sorry, I just said Wendy.
That's all right. I'll take Wendy too. All right, so next we're going to talk about the changes that we made to our data, and we've already discussed our new client outcomes tool. We moved from the family development matrix to the protective factors survey, and we're very excited about that. We also revamped our service tracking. We cleaned up excess and defined the meaning. And so for the network, we've been collecting service tracking data for many, many years on an Excel spreadsheet. And eventually, over time, that Excel spreadsheet got to be how many items long?
95.
95 items long and a little bit big. And so we worked really hard this year on going back to contracts and going back to our vision and what we wanted, what our goals were to actually show that we do and what made sense to track that we do. And so we spent a long time making our service tracking current and defining the meaning of what we were tracking and how you track those things. Is it per client? Is it per family? Is it per caseload? Is it per beneficiary? All these different questions that were kind of just loose in the beginning. And so that's really going to clean up our data, making it more concise and in the end more impactful. We can actually say with confidence what it means when we say that we provided 10,000 meals. We're very excited about that. We've also created a new data reporting system, which is about to come up on a video. One of the really nice things, and I think it was kind of mentioned earlier, that this change and the work that we're doing really benefited a lot from the skills that we had within our network. Mark is very, very good at building these systems. He has the knowledge to do that and the ability to do that, and I'm not sure that that was of access to us before. And so the stuff that we've been able to build has really been available to us because of the skills that we've had available to us. So you'll see the Google surveys and the sheets that we've built in just a minute. New reporting methods, I think again, we'll touch on that in the video. And revised grant and contract reports. And so I think one of the coolest things that's come out of all of this is our new annual reports, where we're going to be able to really showcase the work that we do in a meaningful way. In the past, we had turned in 70 or 80 page Word documents for our reports, and that's great, and it's a lot of content, but to be really impactful and to really get the point across about what we do collectively, we've been able to do that through our new data systems. And so you'll also get a new peek at our annual reports that we have been recently able to put together. So I think we'll skip ahead to the video because it's, is that right? Okay.
Just give it a second.
Okay.
Hello and welcome to Untitled Network of Family Resource Center's brief tour of our data system. In this video, we are going to discuss how HNFRC has gone about setting up a Google-based system to record our quarterly reporting across 16 sites, as well as our protective factor surveys, all the way from gathering the raw data to creating quarterly and annual reports. After this video, we are going to talk in the learning community about some of the lessons learned, some of the obstacles faced, some of the next steps, and then we'll be open to questions. Let's proceed. Before we dive in, some of the questions that are good to consider at the very earliest stages of putting together a new data system are, what what are the reports you're going to build at the end? What will it look like? What are you trying to achieve? What kind of reports are you trying to draw? And this is a question that you really need to start addressing long before you lay the first brick with actually building the system, because based on the raw data that you gather, that's what you're limited by for everything from there. So our network, 16 sites, had questions around, well, maybe we want to be able to draw reports by an individual site. Maybe we want to be able to draw reports by a region of sites. And perhaps we want to be able to draw reports over a trend, meaning over time. These are questions that you want to integrate from the earliest stages into when surveys get entered, when quarterly reports are made, how you ask a couple questions in that report that may not be your typical required questions, but maybe things that help key in data later so that you can draw the specific reports that you may be looking for. So, taking those questions into consideration, how HNFRC proceeded is we found a common system that we could all gather around to use for our collective reporting. And that system turned out to be the Google Suite for Nonprofits. We have basically through G Suite for Nonprofits, I'm going to pull up the page there just so that you can find it later, a way to have more or less email addresses and a common Google Drive between all of our sites. So we have an email at hnfrc.org. What this does is this gives us, between 16 sites, organization level access to file sharing, to report tools that Google has. It lets you elevate beyond the tools where you have to make it so that anybody anywhere could log in anonymously and submit a report. We wanted something where you knew who logged in, you knew what the email address was that submitted the report, and you could do it in a secure fashion. And that's what we've put together here. We've also set up accounts that are not specific to any one person, but are instead specific to sites as a whole. So for example, instead of an account for Kim, it's an account for Blue Lake. And what that lets us do is it lets us have an account that survives any one coordinator or staff member. Okay, so we are ready to dive in. So for our system, we'll navigate to our drive in Google. And then just as a side note, HNFRC uses this Google Drive for more things than simply for reporting. We have, for example, our member resource library, where we put out printable materials, meeting minutes, ROI forms, you name it. It's just a great internal space in order to share things. But for today's presentation, we're going to focus on our reporting system. So every site will have access to this: HNFRC, DHHS, reporting, and PFS. Within this folder, we have a series of files. We've got, in these purple files, our quarterly report forms for CWS, CalWorks, and our protective factor survey. We also have the responses for those folders, or those forms, and we'll get back to those in a minute. I'm going to go ahead and open our protective factor survey. This survey acts as just a simple template where after a site has worked with a client to fill out a protective factor survey and gather demographic information, they can log in and enter their survey responses. And then we were talking a little earlier about what are some of these building block pieces that you really need to gather in order to make sure that your system is robust. These are those questions. Which site are you with? We can figure out which site. And you can see that, for example, Arcata, that's our site, is also a member of HNFRC. I use that as a meta tag so that we can draw a report for all of us later. And we've also tagged in their region. That way, if the sites want to draw it by region, they can. We can answer questions as a pre or post survey. What date was the survey completed? One of the great things about this is, although a standard Google Forms survey gives you a timestamp when you submit it, maybe the survey was done a month ago, and we just now got to the time where we were able to enter a block of surveys. This allows the respondent to enter the survey when flexible for their time. How was the survey completed? The language the survey was issued in. When you're working with an evidence-based tool, it can help you to know some of the different versions or variations of a survey that you've used. A unique code. So rather than trying to get really technical around having every site subscribe to this specific set of coding, we said a simple thing. We said set up a code system at each of your 16 sites that works for you, that doesn't identify your client, but that you're able to tie back any survey response to the person that you issued it to, and then use that code system. So as long as a site said, for example, JFRC001 did a pre-survey, and then I go back in later and I say that JFRC002 did a post-survey, this system that we've built will be able to tie those two together and match them for an outcomes report. We get into our demographic information. The way that we've set up our system for the protective factor survey is to make all of these questions optional. Again, if you make too many questions required, you may end up having people not submit a survey because it was a little bit incomplete. In the back end, the protective factor survey has sub-scoring tools to make sure that if you didn't answer enough questions in one protective factor section, it's not going to record the response. Be really careful about how many things you make required and how many things you make optional. The things at the top are all required here. These are these red asterisks. But once we get into the actual questions of the survey, it's optional. It's gather what you can. So we'll move along here. We've got questions around ethnographics, income, residence, zip code, education level, household income, you name it. Now we get into the actual survey questions themselves, and people will click through. It's a simple survey. And what we found is that with this tool through Google Forms, it's been easy to train staff, 8-Factor AmeriCorps members, anybody coming into their job pretty quickly. It's a tool that they might have used before for a class or a workshop to fill out a survey. And so we wanted something simple, something that we could edit, something that we could train people really quickly on. That's been integral in making the system work fluently. So when somebody's filled out their survey, we'll go to the bottom and they'll hit submit. And a couple things happen. Instantly, that response gets sent into our Google Sheets, which is an Excel spreadsheet type form. And that's going to be, again, on the back end here. So I'm back in our drive, and I go to our protective factor survey responses. And those responses, once you submit the survey, get recorded, time-stamped, who submitted it, and then all the answers along. This is the raw data, and the really important piece here is that you want to gather your raw data in a place where people can access it, any site if they need to, but where they can't edit it. You really want to protect this like Fort Knox. We've gathered our raw data. That's a really important piece. I think if your organization is considering kind of a low-tech way to collect data across multiple sites or across a bunch of different people, if you can get to the point where you have a common form to submit the survey so that you have uniform answers and where you have a way to gather all the raw data in one place, you've accomplished 80% of the battle. From here, it's just a matter of having somebody go in and format this data into a meaningful report. So at this point, this is where we get to the more technical pieces. And from here, when you start to build the actual calculations around the raw data, the formatting of the data, the building of the report, this is where you start to need to look within your organization and say, do I have technically savvy folks? Do I have some people who can really commit some time and some spreadsheet expertise to this? If I do, great, and this next step is for you. If you don't, this is a good time to maybe reach beyond your organization. This could be something where you bring in an external consultant for a little while, where you end up just gathering the raw data and then using one of the offline tools that Protective Factor Surveys has provided. We can talk more about an access-based system that they've put out later. But from here, start thinking about how much time can I commit to the technical side of things. What we're going to do is we're going to show you a little bit about what we did here. So from this raw data, we've had other forms that will pull that data like a window and then format it into the reports that we're looking to build. So I'm going to go into our data cruncher here for the Protective Factors Survey. It's just another spreadsheet. And again, this sheet will pull that raw data without editing it, and we'll just bring it into a new sheet where we can actually kind of manipulate it and work with it. So on the first page here, it's a report. It's pretty simple. If I was to go in and draw a report for HNFRC, I'm going to click three things here. I'm going to click a drop down and pick which site I want. Do I want the network as a whole or just a site? Again, we're going to add tools in later because we're a work in progress here to do things like regions and trends over time. But for right now, we're keeping it simple. So I've got HNFRC selected. I've got a report ending date, and I've got a report beginning date. So what that means is I'm going to pick up whichever surveys were identified as having been taken between July 1st, 2018, December 31st, 2018. From there, you're going to get queried data. And again, that means you filter that data down to just the things that meet those criteria. So in this case, all sites work, but only reports within those time parameters. Now, again, this is where your technical expertise comes in. So if you can look at the top here, it's kind of small text. This is where you start to get into the large formulas. It's not rocket science. It's not going to take somebody an infinite amount of time to do it. I think somebody who can dedicate some time to this, even a lay person, can probably figure out most of these. A lot of it's adding, getting an average, you name it. But again, you start to crunch the data. Ultimately, after you've been able to crunch it, make the calculations you want, format it into table data, we can start to draw reports and graphs. And so this is what we've put together. Again, quite simple. We're able to gather our raw counts for our PFS responses across the different subscale scores at entry and at post. We haven't actually used this specific graph in our report. We didn't like it. It was a little noisy. But some of the ones that we have liked, I'll get down to those, are, for example, this report. So here we go. A nice, simple, crisp, across the 5 protective factors: family resiliency, social support, concrete support, nurturing and attachment, and then there's 5 other questions in parenting skills and child development that are broken out. We have in our dark blue or purple here the average response score for a pre-survey, and in our yellow, the average response score for a post-survey. And you can see that across most of our domains, we're seeing some improvement. Across some, we see a little bit of backslide. And this is where you can put it right into a report and then start to drill down and say, hey, who are taking these surveys? What's going on here? How can we respond to that? So this is not just a piece to make beautiful reports. It's a piece to really start thinking about your work, really start to know what your outcomes look like. How are the programs that you're implementing affecting families? And again, one of the things that we have to think about is, hey, we have 16 sites. And across 16 sites and all of our various programs, we can kind of look at a geographic, regional trend in protective factors and how those outcomes look. But one of the things that this system can do is drill down to a specific site in a specific time frame. So let's say that Arcata set up a new parenting course between July and April of the next year, and they want to look at specifically nurturing and attachment and parenting skills and child development within that time frame. They could draw a report for just their site and just the surveys done within that window, and they can really drill down to see precisely how their program is affecting those resiliency factors. So that's one of the flexibilities of this tool, and one of the things that can make it really powerful is that it can work for one site in particular, it can work for drill downs, you name it. We've also gathered our demographics here. Again, it doesn't take too much. You just take some of those basic demographic responses and turn them into charts, pie graphs, bar graphs, you name it. Now, the nice thing here is all of this is real time. So if a new survey were entered in this realm right now, in about 30 seconds after somebody hits submit and it kind of churns through, my reports here are going to update within that time frame. So what we're able to do is we don't have to keep rebuilding graphs month after month. All I have to do is enter a new query on our report page, either pick a different site or pick new dates, and it's going to churn through and it'll pull the exact report for that, build the graphs, and at this point, it's just copy and paste it into a report. So it's really sped up our reporting process and really simplified some of that kind of laborious data crunching and graph building that we have to do. I guess that, like I said, we no longer have to do. So from here, the question that may remain is, okay, so you built a system on your own. You gathered your data, you put it in one place, you formatted it. It looks like you built it correctly. But is it pretty? Does it actually communicate a good story? Is it something of value to your sites, to your funders, to your community? It's a good question. Our answer to that has been yes. And we're going to show you the report that we've built. This is our first ever protective factor survey report by HNFRC to our funders. And we started with a 75-page report that we've done in years past in our mid-year and annual reports, full of text, tough to digest. We had a funder admit, hey, I didn't read the whole thing. I didn't even read much of it. So we said, okay, let's do something different this year. We're down to our report being about 20 pages. It's loaded with infographics. It's really communicated the data well. We heard back just glowing response from our funders and our community partners that this looks great. We learned from it. We read it. We're excited. Let's move from here. So here's the report. It's got a little bit of information about our protective factors. We go into the basics on what our surveys were in the reporting period for our first draw. There's that graph that we looked at a little bit earlier where we're able to communicate the pre and post scoring. We have our outcomes mapped out here. So in blue, the total number of outcomes that were measured. Here, the number that improved the resiliency factor in that domain. the number that remained the same, and the number that had backslide. And again, that's a report that you drill down into and you start to learn what's working well, what's kind of a wash, and what can we improve upon. And then within the demographics, from those questions that the respondents answered, we've input them here. And one of the things that we're working on right now is to start to compare the data that we gather internally to outside empirical data. So for example, county ethnographic data, or CalFresh data that the state puts out, or labor statistics data, you name it. And so that's kind of the next step here for us, is to start to really tie what we're gathering internally in data and looking at how it pairs up with other outside data. So that's it for our presentation. And if you have any questions for us, you're welcome to get in touch with Amy DeBay or myself, Mark Weller, and we're happy to follow up with you. We look forward to talking next with strategies about some of the lessons learned here and some of the next steps for our network. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you for watching that video. In a few minutes, we'll start taking questions. Before we get there, one of the things that we would like to talk about are some of the lessons learned, some of the challenges faced as part of this process of making this systems change. And I guess right out of the gate, I would say that for anybody here, perfect synchrony during change is impossible. If I could repeat it 10 times, I would. You're going to be the big bad wolf sometimes. Somebody had something somewhere in the past that they liked that worked for their 1/16 of your group that they're missing now. And they're going to have a little bit of a grudge about it, and it's going to be change, and it's uncomfortable. And trying to maintain perfect synchrony is the great way to end up in a stalemate. So what we've done instead is we've had really active participation at our network level as a whole. It's been a part of every meeting for 2 years to be talked about what we're doing with our data. We've had a specific committee working on kind of the deeper dive issues. We've had one-on-one meetings with funders, partners, other agencies. We've interviewed boots on the ground. And the key thread among this is to focus, rather than on perfect synchrony, on keeping people up to speed, on checking in, on rolling things out one piece at a time. So we didn't just magically pop up with this brand new big thing that totally unseated the world overnight. We tried one tool, and then we tried another tool, and then we tweaked them a little bit to make them work right. And at that point, we could implement the next tool. And so it's a process, and it's okay for it to be a little bit slow. But again, that idea of synchrony is really important to kind of get rid of the myth. It's not going to happen. It's not going to work like that. Another big one is that if you're working on new data or new processes, it's new. It's not the old one. And it's interesting because people like to gripe and they like to say, well, I didn't like this, I didn't like that. And then you move to something new and they say, well, I liked this and I liked that and I used to do this and where do I get this anymore? And so there's that kind of change time where people get used to what the new current thing is. It's also an opportunity to keep listening and saying, hey, did we get rid of something that we really liked? Can we pull it back in? Or are we just kind of in a new frontier and we're just figuring out our bearings? And so one of the best things that we've learned from that is just to be patient, to listen, to document. I've watched people who are uncomfortable with the change just kind of on their own over the course of even a couple of weeks and trying out a new tool, like get on board. So it's just not to be super swift at any process there, but to be really good about paying attention and listening to folks because they have great feedback. There's always a little bit of buyer's remorse. With some of our older systems, we had other people crunch our data for us. Mind you, it was not cheap, but it certainly made it not our work to do. And so there are some people who say, hey, well, this is a little bit extra work on our side at times for maybe bringing the crunching into our field. Okay, we've got the people to do it. I think if I had 20,000 in my pocket, we could hire it out if we wanted to again. And that's been our response to that, and it's been okay. Another one here, building systems ad hoc is reliant on available skill. Amy's mentioned it, we mentioned it in the video. It takes some internal knowledge, some internal expertise to be able to do systems change like this. It's a huge time commitment, even from the planning side of things. And then the actual technical side does take some knowledge. But again, when we were talking in the video about how if you can just gather the raw data in one space, and I guarantee you a 13-year-old who has a Google account could make a Google form, could make it go to a spreadsheet, and could gather the raw data, and that is 80% of this. For anybody, I know we had a question prior to this learning community about a different software called Mosaic. There's also a software out there put out by Friends, the people that made the tool, the Protective Factor Survey, that is a Microsoft Access database. It's offline or local area networkable. There are tools out there that if you just had the raw data, you could load it into something else and churn out reports. Our group looked at those tools, we kind of thought about it. There are some things that were appealing about them, some things that definitely would have saved us some time up front, but we said we really want something that all 16 sites can access at any time, for any reason. We want something that you can do from your home office. We do not want a bunch of surveys on paper in a bucket getting mailed out to somebody somewhere to make their life terrible for 3 weeks to crunch data. Those were a lot of the questions that we went through, and that's why we arrived at the approach that we took. So again, look within your team, see if people have time. If they're going to commit to this change, make them really commit to it and support them. This is not something that Amy or I did alone. It's something that we had committees work on. It's something that we had other brains come in and help us with. It certainly didn't take place overnight, and it certainly wasn't one person driving it. And then the other major lesson learned here, and one of the major challenges faced, was not getting married to proprietary software and habitual systems. If I have any grudge after all this, I do not want to name things by name in my contracts. I do not want to live and die by the sword of a proprietary tool. It's a great way to get somebody to start charging you outrageous amounts of money. It's a great way to not be able to make transitions and not be able to be flexible. And to be honest, one of the funniest things is that the funder doesn't usually require it. It's amazing how much sites offer it up all on their own without knowing better. And we have found that the easiest thing to do is to just go back and ask sincerely and honestly of the people that we've made these hardline commitments to, can we make change either in a future fiscal year? Can we make an amendment to this year? Can we open this up a little bit and be flexible? I was not going to change our language from family development matrix to protective factor survey. It was going to go from whatever it was to something generic. And that's important because down the road, we may make a change again. And I would like that when we get to that point that we have less resistance there. And again, with these idea of habitual systems, just stay flexible, listen to people. There are systems that are absolutely great today that may not make sense in 5, 10 years from now. Funding may change, approaches may change, best practices may change, and the tools will change with that. And so we want to make sure that even as we commit to new processes and new systems, we've got our minds open and our ears open because time will change things down the road. Other challenges faced, I guess going back to the big bad wolf thing, there are going to be people who are going to not like it. There are going to be people who will say, or agencies who will say, we really wish it were like this. One of the things, and Amy talked about this earlier, was we had a 95 item service tracking. It's kind of like your 150-point car inspection. Well, we don't have the bandwidth to really do that judiciously. And it's really easy for any one of 16 sites to say, hey, I've got the 3 things I'd really love us to track. Well, you multiply 3 by 16 and all of a sudden we're at 50 before you know it. So it took compromise. It took sites saying, you know, hey, maybe we do home visiting, but the other 15, 16 of you don't. And so maybe that doesn't make sense for all of us to track. Or maybe only a little subset of us do it for this one grant. And maybe it doesn't make sense to have all 16 sites do it. Other pieces of our data that we really had to think about was, you know, what, even though it makes sense at the individual site level, when you add it all up to 16 sites, turns into spaghetti. And a great example of that is we had a line on people attending classes and workshops. And just to give an example, we have sites, some of which are at schools. What do you count? Was it every student who attended class? I have a community center here that's 20,000 square feet that's got 1,000 people through it a week. What do I count? And then we have family resource centers that are a little portable on the side of a school that sees 5 or 10 people a day. And what we saw was, you know, some of those metrics, you add them all up together, you aggregate them, it's spaghetti, it doesn't mean anything. And so it's going through this process that you say, okay, well, maybe we're not gonna ask 16 sites to do something when there's no point adding it up. And again, it's not to say you can't track it at your site, it's just to say that if it doesn't make sense to add it, why would we ask it from all of you?
Yeah, and I think that part of that was us really going back to what do we want to showcase, what do we want to show, and how can we be impactful about that? And if we have a list that's 95 long and only 3 out of 16 sites are even filling in any numbers on, you know, say it's home visiting, or anyway, then it doesn't make much sense for all 16 sites to be tracking it. So if during this all 2 years of this conversation, we did have sites speak up that say, but I'd really like for this to be counted because we really do that. But if all 16 sites don't have at least a piece of that, then collectively it doesn't make sense for us all to track it. And like Mark said, it doesn't mean that you can't track it. No one, everyone can track what they want. And these systems, we've even kind of opened it up for sites to be able to add indicators on the bottom, things that they'd like to track. But collectively, we tried to really, really consider, does this make sense for all of us to track, or is this just something that we've always done and that we think that we've had to do? And I think I was going to mention too that we really had to consider what we were required to do and start there, and then open it up to what our goals were in the future and add those things to make sense for our new data tracking.
And for those who are listening in, Humboldt Network of Family Resource Centers is not new. It's been around since the mid-90s. It started as Healthy Start sites, then over time moved into county partnerships, became the Healthy Start Schools and Communities Partnership, and then around 2012, it got our latest name. It began as, I think, 8 coordinators, and it's now up to 16 sites. So it's been around a long time. One of the things that can come up when you have a long-standing organization or coalition that's been around a while is it can just grow. It's this Hobbesian philosophical thing that you've created a Leviathan that is too big to tackle. It's not too big. It just takes this indomitable spirit and a group commitment to say, let's chip away at the pieces here that we can understand. Let's really stay true to what we're trying to get to. What's this future desired state? What are our values? What is our work? And then you can absolutely work through things like this. And there were definitely times where we almost reached a state of apathy saying, okay, oh my gosh, we're a year into this thing and we've only been able to get through X, Y, Z, and we've got 38 other letters to do. But you'll get there. It takes time. It just takes a lot of work.
And I do think that while we did have some, while it's hard for some sites to change, or for some people who've been in doing this system for a long time to change, and that maybe they said, oh, well, we used to do it this way and I really liked it. I would say that a majority of our members wanted the change, really, really wanted the change. And so I think that there are little tidbits where, you know, they wanted this line maybe on tracking laundry or something like that. But beyond that, I think that we really worked hard to make the systems easier to use. And like we've talked about, just easier for people who are actually doing the work to use, and that makes sense in the work that they do. And so for Mark's slide, it was about challenges, and so that makes sense. But I do think on a whole that the network of 16 people, when we've talked about it, have really been very on board with the changes and not a whole lot of resistance. Okay, so yeah, impact and next steps. I think one other thing that I wanted to mention that we've talked about is that the skills that were available to us to build this, and the time and the commitment. And one thing that we laughed about yesterday is we also have a collective impact grant that we've been working through, and we hired a consultant through that. And so that's another option. If you don't have the skills within your own group, then you can apply for a grant for collective impact, which is a buzzword these days. And we've gotten a lot of help through that also, a lot of unbiased opinion that's been able to come in and say, well, why is it you've been tracking this, and what has that meant historically, and going through it like that. So impact and next steps. Priority is our mission and the work that we're here to do. I've mentioned that a few times. And so having surveys be helpful and not a barrier has been a huge impact for us, and the work that we do with clients, and feeling comfortable issuing the surveys that we now have. Valuing staff time and effort, and unifying for needed data, and allowing for space for individuality and the ease of workflow. Like we've talked about, we still are, sites are allowed to track individual things that they would like to track, that they do on their own, that maybe not all sites do, and allowing for that, and understanding that we're not all exactly the same, and really actually encouraging that, I think, so that we can also show our individuality, but maybe not in these collective reports. And build transparency with funders through this whole process. We've tried to be very transparent about the work that we were doing on our data and making sure to check in to make sure that it would work with the reporting that we had to do based on the funding that we were receiving, not leaving anybody out of that. And creating systems that can be flexible and not getting locked in. As we've mentioned quite a few times, we tried to pull language that was proprietary out of our contract so that we weren't married to that, and making it more flexible so that that could change in the future. And I would say one other impact that I was thinking about was that the way that we are able to share data between our sites now allows for us to learn from other sites and the work that they're doing in a way that we couldn't before. I think that for our site, if we have low numbers on a certain item, I don't know, transportation or community dinners or something like that, and we look over at Blue Lake and they have really high numbers in one of those things, I can go to that coordinator and say, hey, what is it you're doing over there? What does that look like for you? And does that work for my site? Or is my site doing something like that that I didn't even consider could have been tracked in this way? And so I think for us collectively and as a network, it's really helping to improve our ability to track the work that we do and to improve our own sites to say, does that work really well for your community? And could I try that for my community? And I think that making our data open and available for each site to see is really going to help us work together to create a bigger impact for the work we're doing throughout the county. One other thing I wanted to mention was through this collective impact grant, our network has chosen to focus on one specific goal for the year. And this year we chose to identify concrete support as something that we were going to really study and look at and try to figure out our trends of that based on when we first started tracking it and then at the end. And so not only will we be able to figure out concrete supports and how our clients view that through the protective factor survey, but also through our service tracking. And we're hoping to cross-reference those tracking methods to be able to show some kind of valuable data in regards to that. So, yeah.
Well, that takes us toward the end here. You've gotten a chance in the first part to kind of look at our overview. How did this all get started? What got the ball rolling? How did we commit to the systems change? And then in the second half, we got a chance to dive into the actual work that was done, the system that was built, the tools that are in place, some of the lessons learned. I think at this stage, it's just a matter of what questions you have and if we can answer them.
So we'll turn it over to questions again. And as we did last time, people were able to type in their questions, and we'll also, do you have some questions already, Lana?
I do. I have one online question.
Okay, let's take that.
Okay, we'll start with that. This is a clarifying question. How reliable can it be for all agencies when the same thing is not tracked, even if it seems like spaghetti?
When the same thing is not tracked, even when it seems like spaghetti. Meaning tracking something, but tracking it in 16 different ways. I'm going to try to understand the question better. So one of the things that we've kind of talked about is, even if you're at 16 very unique sites and you're trying to track a common thing, and you might measure an inch with a string, and I do it with a ruler, and somebody else does it with their forefinger, it's that, did you measure an inch as an inch? And so it's been this big process of making sure that we understand the definitions, the how to track of a certain thing. In fact, in our new service tracking, we have an entire column dedicated to, for each item, understanding, am I tracking it by beneficiary? What is a beneficiary? Am I tracking it by a case? For example, in CalFresh, what is a case as CalFresh defines it? So again, untangling the spaghetti really means having that thoughtful conversation, and then just some simple reminders right there in front of your face as to how do I do this? And that way, any staff who walks in, mind you, AmeriCorps come in every year, and we get a new group of people. We have interns, we have frontline staff that have pretty high turnover. We really wanted to make tools that were so simple that could be so quickly and easily understood that you could have high turnover staff on your front lines who really got it, who could measure it as uniformly as possible. Is it perfect? No. And one of the responses that we've made to that is that we're starting to look at just a couple rows each month in our data committee and in our major group where we look at the report and we say, hey, this is the most anomalous data. For example, maybe my smallest site out in the boonies has some number 10 times the largest site. Could be true, but probably worth looking into and asking some questions. So again, it's a big thing. We've got a lot of stuff that we do track. We couldn't take it all on at once, but we're trying to whittle away like that. And that's how we build best practices. It's how we build good definitions together. It's how we build clarity around how we track things, what we track, where we track it, and what it means.
We're trying to get it as uniform as possible and to not have it be the spaghetti. Maybe
Although spaghetti is tasty.
yeah, spaghetti is good. I don't see that.
I hope that answered your question.
Any more questions? Do we have,
Jackie?
let's check in with Lake County. Any questions from Lake County?
I think Jackie has one back to you.
I have a couple. First
Okay.
of all, when you were describing the rigor that you applied, just checking my understanding, the pre-post information. That may mean in one agency, they do the post 90 days later and another 120. But the truth is, the two surveys get completed and you match the data like that. And that's an example of what you meant about making the most of the information, but don't put artificial rigor in. Am I catching that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a great one. There's actually in the questions and answers section from the Protective Factors Builders website,
Their manual.
there was a group that asked and said, hey, we have a program where some people will complete it within 6 months, some people it takes years. What's the best practice around this? And the nice thing about Friends is they said, apply it in the way that works right for your programs and sites. Since we're 16 sites and we can answer that question 16 ways, we're just trying to work on some kind of basic best practices, kind of like a minimum threshold. So, and we're trying to decide right now, is that 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? Is it after 4 hours of service? What's the kind of appropriate thing here? I think the simplest answer is to say, the day after you met a client is probably not the time to issue a post survey. I'm not sure you've quite been able to measure an outcome yet. So it's something other than that, and we're just trying to come to what exactly that is. And that's some of the work in progress right now. And I think we're starting to look at it's probably more than about a month or more out, and it's probably 4 hours or more of service. We haven't set that in stone yet. I'm also not putting that in a contract. We are putting in a contract that we will commit to a best practice.
Perfect. And my last thought is, so many of us are stuck in the trap when we have piles of old data that we have the historical data. For me, this feels like you kind of freeze frame and say we're somewhat beginning again, trying to do collective impact work. And so your trend analysis begins kind of from your commencement forward. The other stuff that you may have interpreted in the past as trend or helpful information or historical information, this is kind of a do-over.
Yeah, it's a major pivot, and I think that one of the roadblocks, and it got brought up and pretty quickly distilled, was this question of, hey, how do we compare the new data to the old data? Apples and oranges, don't try to do it, not going to look good. What you have is you have this beautiful history of whatever you were tracking and the trends within that, and it's archived. It's not like you go delete that. So you've got what you had in the past, and then you make the pivot, and you say, from here, blank slate, moving forward, we're in a new frontier of tracking. And so right now, we just issued our first report. We don't have trend data yet. We're only a couple months in. Toward the end of the year, we're going to have a year's worth of data in. I'm thinking probably not until next fiscal year we will really have meaningful trend analysis of what's been going on. You have to have enough entries, some statistical relevance. It takes time, but it's a very valid point. You wouldn't just want to try to tie everything new to everything that was old. It's a great way to get stymied or to start comparing things that really are non sequitur.
And one important part of that was going to our funders and explaining we're going to move to a different outcomes system, and are you okay with that? And they seemed to appreciate that and seemed to be fine with it. So we went on.
Yeah.
Anyone else here have a question? No, before we go. are there some chat coming in or?
Yes, actually, Lake County's chatted in some more comments and questions. The first is a comment. It says, collective impact grant info, please. Smile.
All right.
You bet.
Yeah, you can contact us after this. We'll get you our email.
And then the next question is, are there any other agencies in your county using protective factors, i.e. probation, public health, etc.?
Public Health Safe Care has a parenting program that's using it. Technically, even though A-Factor and AmeriCorps members are placed at our sites, they're done through CAPCA. I'm going to get that wrong. Sorry. CAPC. And so those members are doing the protective factor survey statewide with the child welfare services projects that they're applied to. Within Humboldt County, it's a good question. I don't know of a ton of agencies that are doing the protective factor survey right now. First Five does it. Okay, I've got a hand in the room. There we go. I just learned about another one. That's who we know right now. And I think that it's a survey though that people recognize and they've seen it used by other agencies out there. So it's not something unfamiliar. I'm just not sure quite how many agencies up here use it themselves.
And as we've said, our funder, our public health is another person reporting, or another organization, excuse me, reporting to our funder. And so it made sense for those two to match.
Mm-hmm. And then for the question around a collective impact grant, certainly the financial help to get a project done is great. One of the beauties of that was getting a consultant who was totally outside of any politic, of any history, of anything that could cause some kind of turmoil with us. Who could just give that 10,000 foot perspective of, all right, what are you trying to do here? What makes sense? What works? It's really like, it's cathartic to have somebody who is not so deeply involved in the history and the interweavings of things, who can just say, take a peek, everybody, step back. What are we working on here? What would make sense here? And that was integral, because it is really easy to start to just dive into this, like all this interlocking stuff that we've had going between all of us. And so I've really appreciated that voice throughout this process.
I think that collective impact even just started as kind of a broad grant for our network, and came in and did interviews with all of our coordinators and staff members, and really came out of those interviews and surveys seeing that our data systems and the way that we track data needed to be revisited. And we knew that as being part of the network, but it was also encouraging to hear as a result of interviews network-wide that was an overall theme that we had been hearing. And through this collective impact grant, not only was our consultant able to be an unbiased perspective, but she also had the skills to help us build a lot of these graphs and charts and sheets that you saw. So that was nice also.
Any more questions?
That's all for now.
Okay, just want to ask, Siskiyou okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Susan. Well,
Okay.
we really admire, this is Karen Potts. We were just talking and admiring the commitment of the partnership with the SNAP Ed funds. I'm assuming that it's the SNAP Ed funds from public health that are being transferred to the First Five, well, not First Five, but the Family Resource Centers for your efforts.
Through CalFresh Outreach, SNAP Ed I'm less familiar with by name, but CalFresh Outreach, yes.
So part of your task is to promote nutrition education and CalFresh and other resources in the community, right?
Yes.
Correct.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, quick.
And we already checked with the online folks. Okay. All right, well, that sounds like.
Can I add something else? Susan, this is Karen Potts again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. The only other thing that I would suggest, and this is more of a systems level, what I appreciate is your background with working with First Five, really finding opportunities to increase the partnership between the association efforts of network building and really telling the story specifically for the 0 to 5 population, and the strategies commitment to the there's a level of mutuality, as you know, that really could benefit both efforts by integrating these resources and partnerships to tell the highest level of story that we can for the 0 to 5 population.
Absolutely. Thank you for your comment, Karen.
Certainly, Karen, that the tie back to prevention is something that we've really thought deeply about, and that's that what Amy was describing earlier is our commitment to looking at concrete supports as a resiliency factor this year.
That's
is
right.
to focus on one of those 5 protective factors and say, how are we accomplishing this? How are we meeting people's needs for concrete supports?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the protective factor survey is driven by the individual's perception at the beginning and after receiving services of where they feel that they are at. And so it's going beyond just our numbers and saying, hey, I gave somebody a ride, a bus pass, and this and that, to somebody actually self-reporting, this is where I was and this is where I am now. And that's what we're trying to do, is really to elevate that message up to our funders, to our partners, to the local foundations, to the community as a whole, to say, we really need to focus on listening to people and working on upstream work that really prevents and mitigates some of those risks that can come down later on.
It really, I mean, it tells the story for the vehicles for change, right? You know, so I think it's a great tool, and it really, just congratulations for the work that you're doing in your county through the network.
Thank you.
I agree, Karen, with what you've said. I think we all probably would agree with what you've said. There's a lot of energy around protective factors, actually, in some way or other, throughout our 12 counties that are the northern region, but actually in a broader perspective across the state, most likely. Well, and then you've got, as you're saying, I mean, protective factors comes under its own website and, all of the support that goes with that framework. And so it would be really interesting to think about how we could align our energies more around something that would be in common. It's very difficult. We had this conversation when we were first launching into the learning communities. Is there something, one thing, that we could really try to mobilize around? And possibly this protective factors framework and maybe some data collection around it or something would be insightful for the work that we're all trying to do together. It wouldn't be, necessarily the answer for every question that's being asked, but it's a good place to kind of start building a common platform and aligning ourselves around what we're trying to do for children and families.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. So now is the time when we do a few thought questions together. And again, this is an opportunity for networking in your own, remote locations as well as here. And then we'll share this together as we wrap up. So we have some questions, and what we're just trying to figure out is where are people with their current data collection? And just trying to get a sense of external or internal, it doesn't matter which, if you're doing some internal data collection or whether you're doing it external and maybe doing some sharing. What kind of data is currently being collected out there among your organizations? Do we have something to share? We can have lunch right here. We know protective factors are green.
No.
Anything else? It's hard to say. There's a lot of different things. Yes.
That for us. now.
We measure the effectiveness of playgroups by like similar measures to protective factor survey as far as like parents pre and post feeling whether or not they are supported by each other and the playgroup specialists that attend playgroups. I don't necessarily know the data measurements off the top of my head, but that's good. We evaluate every program.
But I think playgroups are a good example because I think a lot of family resource centers and other entities also provide, and probably under the First Time umbrella also provide playgroups.
Yeah, every now and again we have to write someone or we have yeah, you do reality we're basically just social workers.
Hi there, is that Steve and Brian? Did you have some additional data pieces you'd like to add to this?
Or you have to,
Or do you need to unmute?
I can't understand it.
I mean, sometimes we're busy, other
A
times.
little bit of clarification, Susan, are they supposed to work within their groups right now and then report back? Or are we all working as one
We're all
entity together?
working as one right now.
Okay, got it.
This is just like popcorn questions.
So Susan, because I serve homeless families, I have data collection that we put in an HMIS system that really is just the homelessness component.
And that, I believe, is a data collection system that if you're working with homeless populations, you have to report.
That's another example of a funder requested.
Yes.
Comment from Lake County, we share referrals from data and data to funders.
Anyone else want to add something? Just give you a sense of what kind of data is flowing out there in our communities.
Well, when we were talking, or you described your Excel spreadsheet that went out to 95, I felt better because I think for the State Department of Corrections, for our reentry population, we have one that's probably at about 45. Because, every couple of years they add another suggested support, and we just keep adding it on, and, but I don't know that that's the most effective way, other than just track participation. And so those are, again, that's for the reentry population and their workshops that would help improve self-sufficiency, and some of them are literally things like criminality. So it's just really unique to that one population, and would be unique to that one particular funder too.
Well, I think that they brought out a couple of really key points. One is, what do you really want to be talking about to people? What is really significant about the work that you're doing? And for the protective factors, the element that comes out of that is you're getting feedback from the person themselves. This is what we experienced when we came in. This is where we are now. So you're really getting the personal response to the service that is being provided. And so I think that's a really critical piece, because people can be all over the map with what it is that they're collecting and not have clarity about, this is the statement we want to make about our services. And this is the tool that we're using to be able to convey that. And if you have a lot, as was mentioned earlier, if you have 10 different things that you're trying to juggle at the same time, you don't get as clear of a picture. So, let's move to the next question, unless there is anything in the chat. Okay, so this one will give you a little bit of time to talk about in your groups, about 10 minutes, and that is What kind of challenges have you encountered in terms of data collection? It's not easy, as was mentioned. They put a lot of time and energy and effort into building this system. And so as you're thinking about data collection in your own communities, what have been challenges that have come up? We'll do 10 minutes and I'll check back with you. If you want to talk about it right now, we can.
We had confidentiality kind of, just not concerns, but just questions, establishing the protocol and some agreements and literally memorandums of understanding to kind of agree on the sharing of that information.
Something that we encounter frequently, especially in work that I use as far as measuring progress and impacting prevention of childhood trauma, is that sometimes it's incredibly hard to measure that as far as the fact that trauma and its impacts can be pervasive. And protective factor survey is great along with the family strengthening work, but the 5 protective factors, as we're referring to, are proven to prevent half of what are considered the 10 original average childhood experiences indicators, which is incredible. It's a whole half of 10. But we come up with challenges frequently in how to impact the other parts of that, and specifically other parts that are part of more recent research as far as intergenerational trauma, homelessness, chronic poverty, other parts of that. So that's something we do frequently. But focusing on family strengthening has been incredibly useful as far as it's something that most partners in the county are relatively familiar with, if not have been trained regularly on.
That's a really nice, when you're talking about something that we all can understand and relate to, the notion of family strengthening, I think, has been around and has permeated the work enough so that when we use that term, people understand it. But I definitely see what you're saying about the whole, just this awareness of this epidemic of trauma exposure. Not just here in California or county by county, but this is a national issue, and now moving into toxic stress, which actually encompasses more than what the original discussions around ACEs and those kinds of things brought up. It is challenging to know how to really be able to measure that in a way that tells the story, so to speak. And I know that initially when we were grappling with this in our own community, it was also difficult just with the original 10 questions, the 10 question survey. It was difficult to figure out who gives that. How do you interpret the responses? Why are you doing it? I mean, you might be seeing something from it, but what does that do to help the person, to be able to move forward? And so these are all challenging questions that come up, especially around this issue, because we know that this is affecting a lot of the population in our communities, whether they're seeking service or not, that this is a basic issue, and how to really get, how to get to those underlying issues with people and communities so that the community itself can be strengthened.
I think along those lines, another thing that comes up is how to report and tell the story in a way that's respectful to who we're talking about, and not just a quantitative number, but the qualitative data that talks about, we don't see this shiny, great product right now because we're talking about generational work that's happening. We can't impact something in a year. And we all know the challenges in this county as far as retaining skilled, committed people to be in a position over time to have the relationships to stay where they are. But specifically along the lines of telling the story respectfully, is how do we be responsive to the fact that we have communities locally that have, since time immemorial, have practice-based evidence of what works to build resilience in their communities, and how do we incorporate that into our data measurements or be responsive to the fact that our tools might not be the same as what has worked for some of those populations.
These are all very, very challenging issues. There's an interesting concept that I've been thinking more about. Maybe some of you have heard about it as well. Laura Porter, who used to work with Washington State. Washington State was a forerunner in looking at ACEs, and they put ACEs questions in every county when they look at their behavioral risk management systems. These are questions that they periodically asked just 2 counties across the country, actually. That was one of the places that they began to get a picture of obesity. And when they were able to track and take a look at, this is what we looked like, 10 years ago, this is what we looked like 5 years ago. You probably remember all those maps and all of the stuff that came out at that time. Well, Washington State has put those kind of questions into that survey system, and they did that early on, well ahead of most other communities. Laura Porter was one of the people that worked in that realm at that time, and she is now working with Dr. Anda, who was one of the ACE researchers, and the 2 of them have formed their own kind of consulting group. I can call 2 people a group. And they are really looking at this concept of self-healing communities. And that's something that is kind of resonates for me. I'm not sure I understand the words. The words themselves appeal to me, in thinking about the fact that I think there are resources that people have, as you're saying, in different cultures, in different ways of how they heal. And that kind of appeals to me in thinking about the fact that we don't necessarily need to have people come sometimes from outside and tell us how to fix things, that the resources are right there, sometimes within us and within our communities, to be able to be resilient and to spring back from things if we can identify them. And one of the things that I like about the approach, as much as I understand it, which is very minimal at the moment, is that it really does try to draw from grassroots participation. We have a lot of grass tops in the work that we do. We don't always have the grassroots where we really need the full blade in order for us to get the outcomes that we're looking for in the end. And so what I'm trying to find out a little bit more about that approach is, how does it get the community level engagement? Because it's very strong on that side of things. And I can just say in my own community, that's also the case, that it's difficult to get the grassroots level. But your family resource centers and what the work that you're doing in playbooks and other things like that, that is getting people in and getting that kind of information. I think my 10 minutes are up. And I'm like, oh, I have 2 more minutes. Oh, good. I'm so happy she's keeping me. She's got, my watch is not one of those watches that has the little points for every minute.
But you have kept the discussion streaming live, so that folks who are online can continue to hear. So.
Oh, good. Thank you.
I guess one thing I'd contribute, a challenge with data, especially with reporting, is that there is a lot of pressure to report happy, good, great outcomes. And I after time, I could read this and say, wow, great, we should all pack up and go home. We've solved every issue the way that we talk about it. And it's just not true. It's just not what you see. And so one of the transitions that we've been making very honestly and transparently is to say, not all of this is going to be pretty. I'm going to put in who backslid, who, in terms of when we're going to report on this, what went well, what was a wash, what went poorly. And we're going to have a meaningful talk about it. We're not going to sugarcoat it. And that is so tough. It's seemingly such a lightning rod. People say, they're not going to fund you again, or they might question you, or you won't be as competitive. No, you'll be very competitive because you'll be effective in the community when you learn it, when you honestly address things that are going anything other than great. And it is that management by exception. If we only focus on the stuff that's great, if we only broadcast that, we're really not looking at things that we can be improving upon. And it's something that has come up a lot. It's like these irking, stomach lurching. Why would you show that? Why wouldn't you just show the great things? It's okay.
But you're absolutely right about that. I can remember, having been around for a while, that in the early days when we were thinking about data collection, and data collection has changed tremendously as it has evolved and people have understood, especially this data sharing. That's what people want to see. They want to see that you've made a positive impact, and they want to see it right away. And these issues that we're dealing with, I think, as time has progressed, we realize they're complex. And they're not going to just be resolved like this. And people have to be patient, and they have to keep at it, even though sometimes it's tough and it feels like you're not making the kind of progress that you would like to make. But that's a very valuable point, because people want to show off their good numbers and all of the good things that they're doing. It doesn't mean good things aren't being done just because the numbers are beautiful yet. So anyway, do we have any comments now from our communities out there? Not just yet.
Do we want to try to connect with Steve and see if they want to speak on it?
Sure.
Let's see if we do it in a minute. Steven is at.
He's in Siskiyou, Mount Shasta.
Siskiyou, do you have anything that you would like to add to the question for what challenges you have encountered?
How about our online courses? Anybody? How about Lincoln? No?
Not just yet.
Yes.
I think the challenge that we run into is that this conversation is happening countywide as far as sharing data, like how our agencies that do work that's very aligned, if not completely crossed over, like serving same type families. How are we sharing data, and how do we get on the same page about doing that? We have county agencies that are always willing to share data publicly, and even publicly available data for any lay person to be able to see as far as resources, like mapping it out and making it available. It's not something that we have like one coherent place for any person to go look at, and so that's a really jumbled way for me to explain a big challenge. But
I understand what you're saying, because you're talking about things that everybody faces. There's, in very few counties have I encountered, I think what you're trying to describe is a data repository where data flows into it. Anybody could look at it and they could see, whatever is being collected. In this case, we're looking at protective factors information. If there was, another group of people that were trying to collect around another tool, where could this all reside so that it would be really readily accessible? That is not readily available in most places. And the other question I had, you were saying, how do we share data? Are you talking, there sort of different ways to think about that. So one way is, are you thinking about how people share data when they're serving a common family or children, or just how we share just generally when you're trying to do something countywide and make an impact countywide?
Well, I think both. I think probably sharing data when you're serving the same family is a little more of a vetted system at this point, but countywide across agencies, I don't think it is. In fact, I know it's not. And more specifically, not just sharing the data, but having like resource mapping, like not just having the data, but having a place to have resource referral that may not always be family resource centers, although people absolutely utilize family resource centers for that, but we also have 16, and we also have different capacities of each one. So, I know in other counties, for example, they have helped me grow as a system that is a resource referral point. Other counties have a 211 that operates differently or more cohesively with everything else. I know that we have 211 as well, but we have all these points of resources, right? Like St. Joe's has their resource list, and then DHHS has theirs. And what I'm saying is a challenge that we come up with frequently and hear from the community is that there's no like one central, easily accessible. I don't have to click 10,000 buttons to get to a resource or get dropped off a call. You know, so we're trying. Not to say that there's no efforts to address that. That's not at all.
No, it's not. That isn't easy.
We've had some buzz around that. So the list that St. Joe's had, we digitized it. We put it on our website as a click, drag and drop in real time. And you just click like, what's your audience? What's your service? Let's do 3 things. And it will like filter a list of providers. And there's 500 in the database that will potentially meet that need. And then more recently, we've been talking about how to really build on that to make it actually kind of like an if this, then that decision tree, where I start, I give a little bit of information about myself, like family of kids or individual, situation, conditions, and then it kind of, after answering those couple questions, it filters into a list of things that might be most pertinent to you. And we've been talking about building one for our network, but it brings up all these ifs and all this, like, it can get so big so quickly. And I know Laurel Johnson here, she worked with St. Joe's on the resource list. And the first thing that happened is 100 sites came back and said, our information's out of date. And she's like,
That is the biggest challenge with resource guides. And people like to have their own in a way, you know, because it gives them something that's handy and something that they can contribute, you know, with having that list of resources. We're going through the same question in our own household is, how do we bring all the resources into one place? So the next question, and we'll give 5 minutes of thought for that, is the challenges that we just mentioned. Does anybody have some ideas about solutions? What have they tried to address these challenges? So Mark has just talked to us about the resource issue and kind of how they are looking at it and making it a web-based. We've talked about web-based also because people can just go in there and update. That takes also some commitment and getting people to update their stuff because people don't, they say they will and then it doesn't necessarily get updated and who maintains it. And we thought about, you know, putting our resources into something like a phone book and just putting it out, you know, like publishing it like a phone book. But it's inevitable that you're going to, within a month, have stuff in there that isn't current anymore. And so does that frustrate people, or you know, what by doing it that way? It's not, they're not easy solutions. And as you said, also you brought up the fact that not everybody wants to share their data, even if it would be valuable to do so. There's a certain, I don't know, I suppose there are some reasons that people want to keep that data for themselves. But and even when they make it available, if you're in a meeting or something and they talk about their data, but they don't want to really follow up and give you that data so that you can have it to look at and use for what you're trying to do. So, yeah, there's a lot of, and then you have some people who don't even believe data. I mean, you have people like that in communities too. You can put something in front of them, and sometimes these are decision makers, and they don't even accept the information you're putting in front of them because they are critical of the whole data collection methodology and that you can make it say anything you want, and we're not going to hang our hats on this. So we have people from so many different perspectives when it comes to data. Nobody giving us any ideas about how they met their challenges? Not at this time. And let's move on to the next question. Just kind of trying to summarize and get some ideas and feedback as we close for today. So this is the next question. What excited you about today's presentation? Go ahead and chat about that a little bit in your groups. We'll chat about it here. 5 minutes.
I'm excited about the possibility of potentially being able to access and see across the network, like how using the patient factor survey is impacting your work and how to be a better partner as far as prescribe and elevating that and supporting it. And I just want to reiterate what Karen and Siskiyou said as far as how can we, and when I say we, I would just mean the FRCs, but strategies. How can First 5 be utilized to be more in line with painting the picture and really supporting efforts to support young children specifically? I think that across the state, the relationship, or I'm gonna pause on that thought. That's a bit.
I guess for me, it's just inspiring that it's possible. It just seems like a mountain of effort and work. You demonstrated that it can be done.
Little pieces at a time.
I agree. That's important. That just to be able to see that it's possible to get to this point. And I really appreciated the nuts and bolts also, because there was just a lot of this is how we did it, and this is how we can make that happen too.
I'm excited about the presentation because I got to see that. This is my prediction for being doctor, and I got to see them putting the notes together and actually doing the data at first. What is this? And then now, oh, this is good. And it's exciting. It works.
It would be exciting to be part of it. See it come to fruition. Yeah.
Desiree was my AmeriCorps member down in Fortuna last year. And so she had to be the one giving out 2 surveys and doing all the service tracking. So we tried to make it better.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we were just talking about that earlier. That's one of the big reasons why people don't want to do data, because they end up having to do double entry. And if you have to do double entry, nobody wants to do that. People don't have time to do it once. These are the stories you hear, and to do it twice, that's just not going to happen. So, yeah, if you can streamline it down. streamlining is good under all circumstances in my mind. Okay, we have a comment.
Lake County, through notes I just has said, we are talking amongst Easter Seals, Lake County Office of Education, Lake County Family Resource Center, Probation, and Public Health as to how we can use PFS. And then to follow up with that, they said that the Lake County Family Resource Center can support with CA with exploring Google Suites. So that's exciting.
Yes. That's fabulous. Very good. We're having a good conversation. I got some inspiration. How about Mount Shasta, Siskiyou? Any comment from Steve?
Not through the chat.
Do we have any online books that are still there?
We do. We have about 12, so they're there listening to the conversation. Absolutely.
Do they have anything they want to chat in?
You haven't heard anything yet, but if I do,
You'll let me know.
okay.
This might be the same question, so I don't know. I'm going to ask it, but people might be the excitement as tips that they could apply. So there are two questions that I'm going, I don't have the second one written down here, but I'm just curious about your thoughts. So the question I have written down here is, what tips from today could you apply in your organization? And I'll give you 5 minutes to think about that. And the second part, which isn't written down here, but just came to my mind as something that I'm curious about, and that is, we'll talk about our last learning community that's scheduled for May, and we'll wrap up kind of with that information, and you'll do evaluations. But I'm also thinking ahead to our next series of learning communities that will start in our next year after May. We'll probably resume again in maybe as early as August, but it's hard to get people rallied during the summer because people are gone and doing things. So maybe September is when we usually start. Is there a topic that comes to mind that you'd really like to learn more about as we're moving forward into the next series? So just think about that. Next, we'll give you 5 minutes for you to chat about this and network a little bit in your groups. What tips from today could you apply in your organization? And do you have any thoughts about a special area of interest and moving forward? So while they are thinking about that, any tips? Well, I don't know anything. I mean, I would be the last person you would choose, no matter how many people were in the room, to build a website or do anything, around this kind of work. I would just need them very hard. But nonetheless, I'm able to at least see that this is an open kind of source way to be able to approach data collection, and it is very transparent. And if you had a couple people that had a skill set, this would be an economical way to really go about looking at what you want, what you could do and accomplish across broad partnership to be able to share data. That, I think, it makes it very workable and tangible. Mm-hmm. And I know, as you said, Mark, a lot of people look for something that's already put together, because they may not, I could never depend on my skills to do something. So that may be, their only choice. But if there were some people that you had access to in communities, that really, to me, is a very doable way of going about it. Mm-hmm. and opens it so that everybody can take a look and be part of it. Anything else from this room? And let's get into the end of the meeting. Nobody giving us anything late or
We must still be in conversation.
something isn't happening up. But we must be getting close. Do you have any thoughts about a topic moving forward that might be of special interest to you?
Thoughts, not necessarily on the topic, but kind of the need before deciding on topics. It seems as though strategies has been, as far as like alignment with the First Five Association and difference in trading, a little behind. And in some cases, as far as topics of training, different counties are a little farther along than what the counties are bringing.
Yes.
And so I think it may be useful just to do a little bit of like collection as far as where, like diving deeply into where communities are at before offering certain topics. I know that there's a huge need for alignment between these efforts because we're doing a lot of the same work and have very similar, if not the same mission goals as far as supporting children and families. So just speaking as a member of the First Five Association, I know that that's a big one. And for most counties, if not all, FRCs and First Fives are very much linked, and so treating them as such is also very important. Just avoiding the siloing efforts. No one else? I'm sure no one else wants to chime in?
I'll do one last reach out to I haven't heard anything, but if I do.
Okay. Thank you, Lana. We are so appreciative for Lana because she helps keep all of the different sites connected and keeps the technology rolling along here. So I appreciate your participation in today's learning community. I want to announce that our next learning community will be on May 1st and May 8th. Part 1, Part 2. Some of you may are familiar with Kelly Rizzi. She works for Shasta County Office of Education, She's got a very strong, again, nuts and bolts toolkit for how to practice trauma-informed approaches with children, especially. So we're looking to really draw in anybody that's working with kids, whether that's people in schools, people in family resource centers, people who are doing programs for children, young children, up to adolescents. And also, she's going to be talking about, when I've spoken with her, she's also indicated that administrators would be really good to listen in on this too, because the things that you're trying to move forward with people who are actually doing the work need to get the support from the administrators and the organizations where they are. We're going to have a little bit different format, and that will be our last series for this year for the learning communities. But the first half is 2 hours, and it will go from 3:30 to 5:30. And we're doing it that way because we're trying to capture teachers that will be ending up their school day. So we're going to see if we can get as many county offices of education involved as the host sites, so that the teachers can just easily go there and folks can easily go to wherever their county office of education is located and gather there. And really try to get as many people involved around seeing these tools. Part one is the trauma-informed approach and how it's utilized, nuts and bolts. The part two has to do with resiliency building. So if any of you have heard Kelly already, she's a very dynamic presenter. And she really has a toolkit of things specifically that you can put into practice immediately. And so I just want to put that out there and extend the invitation and advertise it with your colleagues, and we'll see if we can get all the counties involved at one time and try to get us kind of on the same page around the best practices. She's been trained by Bruce Perry on his sequential model, and she's very familiar with all of the research that's come out of ACEs, and she's done a lot of training, so we're fortunate to be able to have her participate with us. So if you don't have any further questions and we don't have anything coming from our groups, then I think that's a wrap for today. And so the one thing that you have left to do is your evaluation, which will be coming shortly. Oh, we're getting them printed out, I see. Okay, good.